We're here at Antigua Forum with Lindiwe Mazibuko. And Lindiwe, you were the fourth youngest parliamentarian in South Africa. And so I'm curious to know, what challenges did you encounter as a young reformer?
There were mostly challenges related to perceptions. So South Africa is still a very patriarchal country. Ageism is still rife, racism is still a problem. So the major problems I faced were people who believed I couldn't be taken seriously because of my age or because of my gender, and often sometimes even because of my race. But I took comfort from the fact that I come from a country where the average age is 24 years old. So to be a 27-year-old MP was not actually as revolutionary as people were making it out to seem. And I'm really happy that today things are very different to how they were 5, 6, 7 years ago. There are many young people in politics, in Parliament. It's become the norm rather than the exception. So I think it was worthwhile. But those early days were tough, yes. But I clung to the legitimacy that comes from knowing that you represent millions and millions of people who are exactly the same age as you.
And what other challenges did you face, sort of speaking as a reformer in general, during your career? Because you've had a quite successful career.
So one of the things I tried to do when I was the leader of the opposition was to reform Parliament as an institution, because it had become, and I think this happens in parliaments all over the world, it had become very government-centric. It was a place where the government presented legislation, where the government dictated the program, where governing party MPs were very keen to suck up to the power at their party headquarters. And so robust parliamentary work didn't get done in the way that it should have been. So we led a lot of reforms which had to do with changing the rules, pushing the constitutional boundaries, making sure the president was there regularly to be held accountable for his work, and that he was answering tough questions, not sweetheart questions from his backbenchers. And we really turned Parliament, I think, into a real robust institution that began to take itself seriously, much more so, I think, than when I entered in 2009. So I think that was probably the biggest reform challenge, was making it clear to South Africans that there is a place for a patriotic opposition that challenges the government and that uses Parliament to hold it accountable.
Why did you initially decide to run for Parliament, or what was your interest in politics?
Well, I entered politics as a political staff member in Parliament, and I did it because I was sick of complaining about the status quo and not contributing to change. So I was tired of the nature of politics in South Africa. It was very much focused on celebrating the liberation movement, that is the ANC, and not focused on modern political interventions and policies that will change the lives of young people who are especially in need of something to believe in. So I felt that the Democratic Alliance, which is my party, was this outstanding liberal opposition party, but it had this reputation. It was seen as a white middle-class political party, and I wanted to show that there were black people in South Africa who believed in liberal policies and who wanted to elect a government other than the liberation movement. So that's why I entered politics in the first place, and my intention was to work from behind the scenes. But sometimes you become part of the process, and then you realize that you need to be the change that you want to see, and you can no longer sort of hang back while other people present the difficult arguments and engage in the pitched battles. So after a while, I thought I could probably do better, represent a different face and a different voice in the party, bring new perspectives, fresh ideas, if I were actually involved in the political process, which is why I decided in 2008, when I was 28 years old, to run for Parliament.
How did you manage to sort of climb the ladder? Because most people who start in the sort of backbenches, they usually don't get all the way into Parliament.
I was a pretty aggressive member of Parliament. I'm lucky because I come from a generation, I spoke earlier about how my country is patriarchal, this ageism is rife, but I come from a generation and a part of society and from a family in which I was always encouraged to speak my mind. So I've never felt like being a woman or being young means I'm not entitled to an opinion. So I learned very early on that it rubbed people up the wrong way, that I was vocal, but it didn't silence me. So I just continued to confound expectations in the way that I had been taught to my entire life. And I learned that had the effect of bringing about some of the change that I was passionate about. So the issues I was most passionate about related to women's rights, the fight against sexual violence, domestic violence, violence against children. All of these issues I was able to take up in earnest in a kind of a really robust way, and confound expectations about what it is to be a young politician or what it is to be a young person in South Africa today, and also bring people with me, other young politicians who wanted to do the same. It certainly wasn't easy, but I was blessed, I think, with the internal resources to be able to deal with the name calling and the mudslinging and the attempts to delegitimize me, and that, I think, kept me going. So whenever an obstacle was put in front of me, I would simply ask myself how I could tear it to pieces rather than stop and go, oh, well, I'd better give up. And when I saw the time for change in our own party's leadership, and when I became disillusioned with the existing leadership, I knew that I had to step up, because I was the party's national spokesperson. I was a big part of the election campaign, and I thought perhaps it's time for the party to show that it can elect diverse leaders, and it can elect and support voices that are different to the ordinary status quo. So it wasn't a very difficult decision to make. It was a difficult process. But as I said, I'm fortunate in that I've never let people's expectations of me wrong-foot me. And luckily, I was in a Liberal Party, where the confident individual is something to be celebrated rather than crushed.
And you recently left politics, and you're now studying at Harvard. Why did you decide to leave or change?
So I thought that I'd worked very hard as in my position as leader of the opposition. It had taken an enormous toll on me as a young person who had gone straight into politics at a very young age. There were a lot of, I think, personal tolls that politics took on me. And although I was able to, push through them, I started to wonder if I was on a path to sort of becoming a career politician, somebody who would over time become jaded and over time would slow down and, to stop to prevent criticism and to deal with some of the difficulties that I'd be ground, slowly down by the system in which I was operating. And I also had questions for myself about whether or not staying in politics from such a young age right through into the late part of my career, I would be able to add any value if I would bring any fresh ideas if all of them were located in the organization in which I was representing the voters. So I took all those things into consideration, and I thought perhaps it was a good time for me after the last general election in 2014 to take some time out, because I have the advantage of age on my side, I have time on my side, and go out into the world and live and work, as it were, on the shop floor, and talk about the economy when I come back into politics from a place of understanding and knowledge about the reality and not just about the political dogma, which I think is what a lot of politicians risk doing when they stay in politics for their entire careers. That's just a long way of saying I wanted to shake things up, and I wanted to refresh my belief in my political purpose in my country and the people in my country, and get a sense of where South Africa was positioned in the rest of the world. And Harvard offered an opportunity for me to do that. So I saw the party through the election campaign, and then after the results came out, I made an announcement that I was going to take a sabbatical.
Can you see yourself, you talked about returning to politics, can you see yourself doing that, or is that what's your plan after Harvard? Absolutely.
The only question is when. And so I would hate for this to be a very short time out, a very kind of superficial time out. I want it to be deep and substantive. I want to actually do reform work somewhere at the cusp of politics and the private sector. I want to learn a little bit more about how governments implement change, how they grow the economy, how they create economic opportunities for their citizens through interactions with the private sector. And I can do that from the outside and then be able to go back into politics with far more nuanced understanding and appreciation for the difficulties of implementing those changes. So, as I said, once you're in politics for a while, you become defined by the party narrative, the party line, the ideological, dogma, and perhaps you're not as in tune with what's happening in the world, which you propose to want to run someday. I don't want to be in that position. So, in the medium term, I think I will probably stay out of politics as well. But my long-term goal is to come back. And I've probably got my eye on the 2019 general election in South Africa, which is in 4.5 years' time.
So going from your own personal future to South Africa's future, what do you see as the biggest challenges for your country? And are you an optimist or a pessimist?
I'm a huge optimist. I mean, I wouldn't have been in politics if I weren't. But I'm incredibly worried about my country. One of the things we do in the Democratic Alliance is we have partnerships with liberal political parties throughout the African continent, and many of them are parties of reform and parties of change. Many of them are political parties that have won national elections from the liberation movement and then been forced into a power-sharing deal because of the violence that has escalated as a result of the governing party not wanting to leave office. So I'm conscious of the fact that South Africa has to go through a peaceful economic political transition in the same way that it went through a peaceful political settlement in 1994. Once we have changed governments at the ballot box peacefully without an insurrection from the governing ANC, I think we'll know that we have the makings of a mature democracy. And the sooner that happens, the better. As long as it is not happening, a culture of apathy in the governing party, of impunity, corruption, maladministration will continue. Over time, voters will lose faith in the political process because they'll believe that their vote doesn't have an impact. So we have a double responsibility, I think, as a political party to be that hopeful, aspirational political party that people can put their faith in, to grow in a way and at a speed that will put us in a position to enter government soon. And then, to work towards finding the solutions to our biggest problems in South Africa. And these are issues as far-ranging as unemployment and job creation, which is the biggest issue in South Africa. At the broad definition, unemployment is over 30% in South Africa. Young people reach the age of 30 without ever having worked before. And that, to me, is a recipe for unrest that can be capitalized on by populists and demagogues to the left. So we have to be an energetic, innovative, modern, forward-looking political party, and we have to offer young voters in particular, young black South Africans, an alternative that's going to change their lives. And we have to do it very quickly. The arc of history in our country depends on it. And if we can do those things, then South Africa can take its place as a leader in Africa, as a leader internationally. We can have a good story to tell about having overcome racialized oppression, having overcome, the teething problems of early stage democracy, and having solidified our position as an open and free and equal society. So I'm hopeful that that's a possibility, but I worry that time is not on our side. And I'm conscious of the fact that we have to work hard to make all of those things happen and to realize the potential of our country.
Thank you very much, Lindiwe.
It's a pleasure.